Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on suicide prevention and safety planning. We are so happy that you are here with us today. My name is Jasmine Griffin, and I will be your facilitator today. I am a licensed professional counselor with over a decade of experience in mental health, program management, and trauma-informed care. I have served in roles spanning case management, supervision, and leadership in nonprofit and government settings. Most recently, I worked with IRC Dallas's site as Health and Wellness Senior Program Manager, overseeing programs such as intensive and supplemental case management, mental health, client voice, and food security programs. During my tenure at IRC Dallas, I also stepped into a role as interim deputy director, guiding the team through significant leadership transitions while maintaining the delivery of high quality services. I hold a bachelor's in sociology and criminology from Cleveland State University and a master's of professional counseling from Grand Canyon University. I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Ashley LeBlanc. Ashley is a technical advisor for mental health and psychosocial support at International Rescue Committee, or IRC. Previously, Ashley worked as a psychiatric emergency responder in San Diego County, provided trauma and substance use counseling within community clinics, shelters, and the VA hospital, managed the monitoring and evaluation design and data collection processes with Women for Women International, and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Eastern Guatemala, supporting the municipal government. Ashley has a master's in social work from the University of Washington and a master's in international affairs from the University of California. So by the end of this session, you will be able to identify protective factors, risk factors, and warning signs of suicide, apply 4 practical skills to ensure your communication with clients about suicide is assertive, clear, and compassionate. Implement the 6 questions of the suicide risk screening tool with fidelity and confidence. And finally, create effective suicide safety plans with clients, including 6 key elements. With that, I will go ahead and pass it over to you, Ashley.
Hello, hi everyone. I know we have a really large group today, and that's wonderful. It shows how important this topic is, and I appreciate your openness to wanting to learn more. So I do want to know before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that discussing suicide can be a very emotional topic. It can be a topic that touches us professionally, it can touch us personally. So please prioritize your own well-being. Take breaks, check in with yourself, and seek support if you need. We're going to start the first section of this training, and we're going to focus on protective factors, risk factors, and warning signs for suicide. And we are going to kick off with a Slido because we'd like to hear from you. This is the interactive tool Slido. We're going to be using this throughout the webinar quite frequently, and you can join Slido in 2 ways. So there's the QR code on that upper left-hand side. You can scan that with your mobile device. You can also go to slido.com, and we have that code. And great, it looks like some people have figured that out very quickly. So the question we're asking are, there are warning signs. So there are often warning signs before someone commits suicide. Is that true or false? And I know we have a really large group, so I'm going to give it some time to have some more answers get all set up on your Slido. And yeah, the majority of answers are in line that yes, most of the time it is true that there are warning signs before someone commits suicide. and we're going to talk about that. There we go. So suicide can be prevented, though it is really important to know that not all suicides are avoidable, that many can be prevented. And the key way to prevent that is that we're going to look at recognizing warning signs, and then we're going to determine an individual's level of risk, and then what is the most appropriate way to intervene. So recognizing warning signs and responding with care and the appropriate level of support can make a critical difference, a life-saving difference to an individual. These are all things that we're going to discuss today. So I want to start with some statistics. These are from the latest CDC, or Center for Disease Control and Prevention report. It was released in 2023. And I want you to note that in 2022, there was an estimated 1.6 million suicide attempts in the United States, and that nearly 50,000 Americans died by suicide. And this impact has kind of like a ripple effect on families and communities, because when a loved one dies by suicide, that bereavement process tends to be a lot longer, much more complicated. Over the last 2 decades, we have seen a 36% increase in suicide rates. And this is especially concerning for youth, because suicide is the second leading cause of death for the age groups 10 to 14 and 20 to 34. So these statistics are just highlighting the significant impact that suicide can have on the communities, especially those that we work in. A key part of suicide prevention is understanding risk and protective factors, and this might be something, these terms you might be very familiar with. So a risk factor is a characteristic that makes it more likely that an individual will consider, attempt, or die by suicide. On the other hand, a protective factor is a characteristic that makes it less likely, right? So examples of this could be increased access to mental health care or having really strong social supports. So when we think about these in the context of suicide prevention, we're seeking to reduce the factors that increase suicide risk while increasing the factors that protect people from suicide. And through direct service, through the work that many of you are doing, that is what's happening. You are increasing those protective factors. You're connecting individuals and families to resources and supports. And we're going to look at these in kind of buckets. Our first category is going to be health. So what are health risk factors that we want to consider? So one is substance abuse. And the reason that is concerning is that substance abuse can really impact impulsivity and decision-making, something that can be really risky when someone is having suicidal ideation. Another risk factor is going to be a physical illness, especially if that's not treated, if someone doesn't have access to medical care. So like a chronic illness, or if someone's experienced significant pain, that can be a big risk factor. And self-harm behaviors. And so what self-harm is, that's a term for when someone deliberately is hurting themselves or hurting their bodies, like cutting or burning oneself. So that is also a risk factor. And then there are certain mental health conditions. Things like depression or bipolar disorder do have higher risk factors. And now we're going to look at the other side. So those protective factors that we're looking to really increase. So health protective factors are someone who has optimal physical health, access to health care, someone where their emotional well-being is strong, an individual who's using positive coping skills, and that access to mental health care, right? So are we able to refer people and give them access to mental health care? So by providing any of these protective factors, so you're assisting somebody with a medical appointment, you're teaching coping skills like deep breathing, or who do you go to talk to when you're having a hard time? These are all things that are decreasing risk, things you're probably already doing right now. So our second area, social or environmental factors. So social risk factors. So examples of that could be someone who's really isolating or is just isolated because they're new to the community. There's a lack of support. One of the things we really look at in suicide prevention is any type of access to a lethal means. So are there firearms in the home? Is there a lot of medication? We want to kind of reduce the steps that it would take in order to have access to a lethal means. And as mentioned before, any kind of barriers to accessing care or really any support, those are going to be environmental risk factors. I think one of the more significant in suicide prevention is a recent loss. So this can be loss of a loved one. It could be loss of a job that really increases financial stress, or for many of our communities, loss of identity, loss of their community. So those losses are a risk factor we want to consider. And then again, on the other side, what are the protective factors? How do we decrease risk by increasing those social protective factors? So strong connection to family and friends, engagement in meaningful activities, so connecting people to work when possible, school, volunteering, or a connection to faith or belief system. So having that social support, that social safety net is really important. And again, suicide prevention is seeking to reduce those social risk factors and increase the social protective factors. So connecting individuals to community supports is a key way that we can do it. And so when we're evaluating risk, we're gathering information to evaluate risk, it's important to consider not only what's happening with an individual currently, but also history, as history can predict future actions. So history risk factors to consider in the context of suicide prevention is a history of self-harm or suicide attempts. As we'll see in the screening tool, and we're going to talk about that later, a history of suicidal behaviors significantly increases someone's risk. So it's something to be very mindful of. And other risks like a family history of suicide or history of trauma and abuse are also risk factors. And then we have the protective factors. So historical protective factors would be positive attachment to caregivers and a positive childhood or absence of abuse, and then that demonstrated resilience. And that is a component we see in many of the individuals and families that we work with. And so we may not be able to change an individual's history, but we can be aware of the history and connect them to supports to address things like a history of trauma to help increase coping skills and resilience. So we've looked at our risk and protective factors, and another important piece is warning signs, right? So warning signs are indicators that suggest potential danger, risk, or problems. And I think of warning signs as often a change, right? Especially a sudden change. But usually there's a change like a change in mood, a change in what people are saying, what people are doing. And so one of the first areas we're going to look at is mood. So if you're exhibiting like a shift in mood, you're noticing things like symptoms of depression, irritability, a loss of interest in things that people were interested before, anger, and then shame is a big one to be aware of, feeling like you're a burden. And then also the change in what people are saying is a warning sign, right? So what are individuals saying to you? Are they talking about, for example, being a burden? Are you noticing people talking about feeling hopeless, being trapped? And then certainly if an individual talks about killing themselves, saying things like, I wish I'd never been born, I wish I'd just disappear. So these are things we want to be keeping an eye out for. Then lastly, behavior, right? So oftentimes we are in the position of really observing behavior. And is there a change in what people do? Is there a new behavior or has behaviors changed? So again, isolating is one to really think about. An increased use in drugs and alcohol or other reckless and aggressive behavior. Very concerning behaviors would be telling people goodbye, giving away prized possessions, if someone's looking for information online regarding suicide, and then we call preparatory acts. So behaviors such as collecting pills, handling weapons, writing a suicide note, those are obviously very, very concerning. So let's now, with all this information, we're going to go ahead and do a case study to try to review.
Awesome. So for this webinar, we will be using a fake case scenario to check for understanding. So the client's name is Zara. Again, this is not a real client. We will have two follow-up questions right now. So if you all can please get your Slidos ready. So the case scenario states, You are an economic empowerment caseworker who has been working with Zara for 4 months. Recently, Zara lost her part-time job, and since then, she appears to have lost weight, looks more tired than usual, and rarely engages in classes and your individual meetings. Based on your intake assessment, you know that Zara has no health issues, but reports a previous diagnosis of depression. She talks positively about her connection with her family. Zara states she has made new friends and often attends community events. So, our first Slido question: what are warning signs you notice in Zara's scenario? We have a multiple choice option here. So recent job loss, withdrawal, low mood, positive connection, family and new friends, or no health issues. And we're looking at warning signs. Looks like we got about half of you all responding. And the first answer is correct. So great job. I'm so glad that you all understand what the warning signs are. So with Zara, it's recent job loss, withdrawal, and low mood. Our second question for you: what are some protective factors that Zara has? Family, new friends, strong connections to family. Yes. Family and friends, connection to the community, connection with others, good relationships, access to support services from the organization. That's a good one. The community, connection to economic empowerment services. Awesome. You all are hitting it right on the head. No health issues outside of previous diagnosis of depression. Yes. So you all are doing a phenomenal job. Keep the answers coming in at identifying those protective factors. On the other hand, when we think about risk factors, those include the loss of her part-time job, the noticeable weight loss, her looking tired, and the lack of engagement in her classes or meetings that she's also reported of having that diagnosis of depression. So great job, everyone. Back over to you, Ashley.
Hi, great job on the Slido. I was worried I went too fast, but you guys got it. So we learned about risk and protective factors and warning signs. So now we're going to move to communicating with clients about suicide. And we're going to go back to the Slido again, and we're going to look at what are some key points to consider when approaching a conversation about suicide with a client. What are some things you would do? What are some things to keep in mind? Location, great. The person's mood, where are they at? Are they open to hear you? Culture, absolutely. Privacy, trauma history, yep, ensuring safe environment. Let them know you're in a safe place, talk openly, see the client's mood, client's body language, non-judgmental. These are great. Empathy, listening. Yeah. So definitely themes of like making sure there's privacy, considering where the client's at, building trust, rapport through empathy, thinking about any cultural impacts, thinking about their history. Don't be unclear or vague in your questions. Yeah, we're going to ask direct questions. We're going to talk about that more later. I'm not an expert in this. Could refer to a health professional. Yeah, I always say I'm not an expert. You're the expert, and there are experts I can refer you to. So these are great. Welcoming tone. Thank you so much. These are wonderful. Do not make decisions for the client. Absolutely. Confidentiality. All right. Well, we're going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to say probably all of these things again. Great job, everyone. So how to talk about suicide. So it is very understandable to feel hesitant to ask about suicide, worry about saying the wrong thing. Research has shown that asking directly does not increase risk. It can actually reduce risk because you're showing that you're a safe person. So if you are concerned, it's important to ask, and we'll obviously go over that more later. We're going to talk about some of the things to keep in mind. So that first came up a lot in the Slido. So when you're talking to someone about suicide, the first thing we want to do is really think about the space we're in. How do we make this a private, confidential space? How can we make it a comfortable setting? So if you're in a public area, you can try to gently move the person to a more private location. If you're in a virtual setting, you want to be aware of kind of who's in the room with you, and also maybe advise, could the individual move to a more private space? If there's people around, they'd feel more comfortable, that feels safe. So yeah, private, confidential, comfortable space. And the next also came up is talking openly and directly. So that has a lot to do with our body language, right? We're going to be calm in the chaos. Even if this feels really uncomfortable, the most important thing we can do is be a safe person, have a calm tone, kind of open body language. We want to give the individual, the person, our full attention. So if we're, writing notes or look hectic, that's how it's going to feel. So if we have to use a computer or taking notes, we want to explain. Usually in this scenario, we really want to just be focused on that individual. And we're going to ask direct questions, and we're going to discuss that more when we talk about the screening. And also, which came up many times in the Slido, is we're going to engage with compassion. We're going to show empathy and understanding. I am a safe person to talk to. You are not alone. I care about your well-being, and I'm competent. Like, I know what to do. And if I don't know what to do, I know how to connect you to someone. So we're going to engage with compassion. And then always when we're working with clients who are demonstrating any type of risk, we are going to always link to resources. And that could be professional help. I think at a minimum, we want to provide a crisis line. So we want to think, if I wasn't here in this moment of crisis, can I make sure that I provide some? If something changes later, if I wasn't here, do they have the resources to connect to that support? Those are essential in a moment of crisis. And then finally, kind of in general, we always want to follow up, right? We want to ensure there's a plan. Even if the risk is really low, we want to make sure there's a plan. We want to continue support. How are we going to check in? How are we going to know if something changes? And of course, we're going to document. We're going to document the conversation and what actions we took based on the information we had. And so here are just a few reminders when you're talking with individuals about suicide. So first, it's better to ask than to say nothing and be mistaken, right? There's more harm in not asking than in asking. Where listening and understanding can provide the client with relief and validation, and you with more information. So there's kind of two things at once. So if we're listening, we're understanding, not only are you providing that client with that sense of relief, but you're able to kind of get more information so you know what is the next collaborative step I'm going to take. Asking shows the client that you care, you're willing to listen, and you can assist them with how you're feeling. So again, you're demonstrating, I am a trusted person. Even if the client is not thinking about suicide, asking creates an opportunity to let them know you're always there to offer support, right? Things can change, or to connect them to other support if things get worse. So oftentimes the same things we're doing with someone who even has a low risk or no risk for suicide is how we support individuals. We're connecting to services. What are the barriers? How can we increase those protective factors? So now we're going to return to the scenario.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. So let's remember Zara. We talked about risk factors, protective factors, and warning signs. So some of Zara's risk factors were her loss of employment, the noticeable weight loss and fatigue, history of depression. Protective factors were strong family connections, offering emotional support, her community engagement and involvement, her friendships, and then some warning signs. So some warning signs we noted were significant weight loss and appearing more tired than usual, decreased engagement in classes and those meetings. This could all be, possible emotional withdrawal or signs of a depressive episode coming. So to add on to this scenario with Zara, we have um, a second piece to add to this. So due to your concerns, you decide to meet with Zara to learn more about how she is coping. After class, you approach Zara and ask if she has a moment to talk. So on your phones, if you could pull up Slido again or your computers, how might you approach Zara in this conversation? What skills do you think that you would use? So as you're thinking about this, maybe think through your demeanor, the environment, your word choice, other people in the area, access, I statements, offer support and assistance, open-ended questions, empathy, calm, finding a private space, assertive communication, offer support and assistance, empathy and active listening are coming really big. Eye contact, very important. Approach with respect, validate, validate, validate. Safe space, reflective listening, ask directly, yes. Validation for why she is feeling down, cultural competency and understanding, meeting her where she's at. Y'all are rocking this. Keep the answers coming in, friendly approach, positive praise. Yeah. A lot of you noted the location too and ensuring that, she's in a private space. Awesome. Kindness. Yes, with hope. Love these answers. You all are doing phenomenal. So next we're going to get into how to actually have this conversation and specific questions that you would need to include. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Ashley to walk us through that.
All right, so we are going to talk about a suicide risk screening tool that you can use in your work. Right, we have chosen for this webinar to highlight the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, also CSSRS, known more commonly as the Columbia Protocol. And so this is a suicide risk screening tool. It's used to determine an individual's risk, low, moderate, high, and it's designed to be a series of really simple, direct, plain language questions. So it's designed for anyone to use. And one of the reasons we chose this is that there are excellent resources and training materials on the Columbia Protocol because it is so widely used. We're going to put a link to the website that has all of these training materials and tools and guides in the chat. And it's also going to be on the resource list at the end of the presentation. So again, it's the Columbia Protocol, and the website, I believe, is called the Lighthouse Project. And so we're going to look a little bit at the history of the protocol's development. So the protocol was developed by the National Institute for Mental Health in 2007, so almost 20 years ago. It was in 2011 that Center for Disease Control, or CDC, they adopted the protocol and recommended this for all data collection. The next year, the FDA, or Federal Drug Administration, declared the Columbia Protocol the standard for measuring suicide ideation and behavior in clinical trials. And now today, the Columbia Protocol is used in multiple settings across 45 nations and 6 continents. Though it was originally developed in the beginning to work with adolescents, it's used with adolescents and adults in many settings. And so the way the protocol is organized is in sections of questions related to suicidal ideation, suicide plan, and suicidal behaviors. And so we want to have a really clear understanding of the definitions of each of these terms, because that's sort of how we ask these questions. So suicidal ideation. So this is a broad term, and it's used to describe a range of contemplations, wishes, preoccupations with death and suicide. So these are suicidal thoughts, also called suicidal ideation. So examples are, I'm having thoughts of killing myself. And next we have a suicide plan. So the definition is an individual's thinking about a suicide attempt that includes elements such as a time frame, a method, and a place. So we're talking about starting to think about how this is going to happen, right? So an example could be someone stating they plan to take a bottle of pills when they return home, right? There's a method, there's a time frame, there's a place. So that is a suicide plan. And then finally is suicidal behaviors. So suicidal behaviors are a suicide attempt, suicidal ideation, planning, or preparation done with the intent of dying by suicide. So it is kind of an umbrella term. An example of suicidal behaviors would be those preparatory actions I talked about, obtaining a gun, saving medications, or saving those with the intent to overdose. Those are what we think of with suicidal behaviors, self-harm. So now we're going to look at the protocol. We are going to go into more detail. I just want to give kind of an overview of all of the 6 questions. So the Columbia protocol, it's 6 questions long, so it's nice and short. It's intended to be simple and direct, and I'm going to go through and read the questions. So question number 1, have you wished you were dead? Question number 2, have you had thoughts about killing yourself? Question number 3, have you been thinking about how you might do this? Question number 4, have you had these thoughts and had some intention on acting on them? Question number 5, have you started to work out or worked out the details of how to kill yourself? Do you intend to carry out this plan? Question number 6, have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? So that is the protocol, all 6 questions, but we're going to go a little bit more detail. So again, the protocol, it's bucketed in these areas. And the first is suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation. So notice a time frame at the top, whether and when in the past month. So we want to be adding a time frame. So in the past month, making sure you're adding that in the questions. And we're looking at thoughts about suicide. So question number 1, have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? And then we'd follow up with asking the second question, have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself? If an individual answers yes to either of these questions, we're going to move on to the next grouping. So the next grouping is a suicidal plan. So now we first asked about, do you have thoughts? Someone said yes. Okay, now I want to know, are those thoughts starting to develop into more of a plan, right? Again, we are asking questions to assess risk so we know what is the appropriate action to take. We're seeking to learn more so we know how to collaboratively move forward with the client. So we're going to ask, have you been thinking about how you might do this? The fourth question, have you had these thoughts and had some intention of acting on them? And then question 5, have you started to work out the details of how to kill yourself? Did you intend to carry out this plan? And so if there's a yes to these questions, we're going to move on to our last question. So that last question is focused on suicidal behaviors, right? Both historically, so remembering that a history of suicidal behaviors is a risk factor. So we want to know kind of now and also historically. And again, examples of suicide behavior include taking more medication than was prescribed, obtaining a gun with the intention of self-harm, a history of a suicide attempt. So we're going to ask the individual, have you done anything or started to do anything or prepared to do anything to end your life? And if the answer is yes, we want to know, was this within the past 3 months? Our risk, how we assess risk and decide risk levels, if that suicidal behavior was 15 years ago, and I've done a lot to increase my protective factors versus that was last week. right? So that's a really big difference. We want to get a sense of that time frame. So those are the questions. And what I really like about the Columbia Protocol, and what you'll notice from that link that we shared, is that in the Columbia Protocol, there's actually color-coded risk levels. Like if they answer yes to these questions, they're low, moderate, or high risk. And we're going to go over some examples of someone who would fall into a low risk category. So low risk would be someone who only responds yes to those first questions. The first questions about thoughts, but not to any other questions, right? So this is someone who has had thoughts that maybe they wanted to die or they'd not wake up, or someone who has thoughts about actually killing themselves, but they've never really thought about how to do this or taken any action. So this is someone we would consider to be a low risk. And then what would we do as a provider for someone who is low risk? So again, we're always looking to increase protective factors. So we're going to explore what are some natural connections and supports. We'd want to know what are there other risk factors, and there's ways that we can connect them to supports. Is that connection to medical care, financial support? I would always provide a crisis line because things can change and we cannot be there. So we want to empower individuals to really take on their own care. So we want to provide that 988 is our national line. And then this is a point that we really want to be developing a safety plan, right? We're going to talk about that at the end. What are things that the individual can do for themselves and how can they get support? All right, so now let's look at a scenario where someone has a more increased risk. They're not low risk, but there's this kind of, say, moderate risk. So an example would be an individual. They've indicated that, yes, they're having suicidal ideation, there's thoughts, and they have been thinking about how they might kill themselves. But they denied an intention to act on the thoughts. It's often referred to as a plan without intent. And I want to remind you that there are lots and lots of resources and training on this. That's why we wanted to use a Columbia Protocol. So just think of this as like an introduction, not that you need to remember all these scenarios, as an introduction to this idea of low and moderate and high risk. So another example, someone who's moderate risk is someone who endorses suicidal ideations, they're having suicidal thoughts, and if they have any history of suicidal behavior. So even if they didn't answer yes to question 3, there's 1 and 2, yes, I'm having suicidal thoughts, and 5 years ago I did have a suicide attempt. That would increase someone's risk to more moderate and not just low. And that is you'll see that in the Columbia Protocol. And what actions would we take? So what are we doing when we have realized someone it's not low risk, it's not high risk, we're really in that moderate area? Again, we're going to provide a crisis line. That's number 1. We are going to look at how do we increase contact points? How do we increase visits? How do we really make sure there's some referrals to support services, especially mental health? How do we follow up and check in with client regularly? We either want to review a safety plan that's in place, and if there's not, we want to develop a safety plan. And part of that is really, is this working? Would this work? Is this realistic? And once you have, I would say most cases you'd consult with a supervisor, but certainly if the risk is above low risk, we always want to be consulting with a supervisor, or if you have in-house staff that are behavioral health staff. So we definitely want to be consulting, as every situation is different. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about high risk. This is where there could be an immediate intervention, is when we're working with clients who are at high risk. And again, we're going to give some scenarios. So during the screening, we have someone has endorsed suicidal thoughts, right? And a plan. So they've already are at moderate risk, and they're reporting that they have some intention. So that question 4 and 5 is really on plan with intention. So they have some intention, they've really worked out the details and have some intention of acting on that. Or it could be someone who says, I'm having suicidal thoughts and I've had a suicide attempt 2 weeks ago, right? That's someone with high risk. If there is suicidal behavior, that question number 6, within the last 3 months, that is someone who has recently had a behavior that put their life at risk. And so that's someone who is going to be at high risk. And we want to really take thoughtful steps. So even if someone's having, we just want to clarify, even if someone is having suicidal thoughts, this doesn't mean we necessarily have to do a hospitalization, right? That hospitalizations are really for imminent risk of safety, right? Definitely at this point, we want to bring in a trained behavioral health provider to do an assessment. We want to do a consultation. That could be through a resource like 988. That could be within your own setting. So what other actions would we take? So someone who's at really high risk, especially if you feel like it's imminent, you're going to want to remain with a client. If you're in person, you're going to want to try to remain with that client, either yourself, if that doesn't feel safe, in a pair. Immediately consulting, not a case consult later, immediately consulting with someone. If there really is an imminent risk, we're going to want to call first responders. Sometimes in these scenarios, you can still safety plan. Sometimes the calling of first responders is a safety plan, and that's something you would do more in more of a follow-up. So again, these are some examples of actions we would take depending on that risk level. And I'm going to pass it over again to go through our scenario.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. So during your conversation with Zara, she sobs frequently, saying she feels guilty. She can't provide for her family. She tells you she has not been answering her friends' phone calls and says, I feel like a burden. I wish I could just disappear. So thinking through this response, what questions might you ask Zara after her response to you? So again, Zara said that she was crying when you approached her. She says that she feels guilty. She can't provide for her family. And she tells you she hasn't been answering phone calls from family and friends, and she feels like a burden. Can you tell me more about that? How long have you been feeling this way? I am here to help you. Questions one and two. What do you mean by disappear? Validate her emotions. I'm here to listen. You're saying you wish you could disappear. Can you tell me more about that? How are you feeling right now in this moment? Can I, asking permission, I like that one. Can I ask you some questions? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? I am always here to help. I would like to gather more information, getting that clarity on what she means by disappear and how long she's been feeling that way. I understand that you are having a challenging time. I am so sorry that you're going through this. What can I do to help? Encouraging her to talk more about it. Yes. Okay. Keep the answers coming in, y'all. I see some really great answers. Asking her, can we talk about your feelings? Would you be open to talking to me about this in a private space? Going back to that asking permission. Good. Okay. So we're going to add a little bit more to this scenario. So let's think about what you might do next. So you begin conducting that Columbia protocol. Zara states, yes, she has been thinking about dying, but no, she has not had thoughts about killing herself. So let's think about what you would do next based off what Ashley just taught us. What are some things that come to mind? Safety plan, provide the crisis line. And as you all are thinking about this, remember our job is to gather information to assess for risk as the service providers. And we do this by going back to that screening tool and getting those first two questions asked. providing referrals, therapy, thanking her for trusting you. Yes. Establish times and methods for continuous check-in. Ask her if she would feel comfortable seeing a therapist, making those referrals. Provide resources. Are you willing to open up and speak to someone about your thoughts and feelings? Explore creating a safety plan, providing the crisis line, providing resources and the contact information about um, for a therapist or a specialist. Asking her if she's comfortable to go into that conversation. Yeah, so based on the information that we gathered, we can conclude that she is low risk. So you all hit it right on the head saying safety plan, providing the resources, 988, increasing her protective factors is also something else we can do. So we know that she has strong family connections. So making sure that she's able to get to those family members or get to those community events, getting in contact with her friends and providing a social support network for her. So even connecting her to, a community center, a local mosque or something that may be appropriate for her. So great job. So even though she said no, it is still important that we ask about those past behaviors. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to you, Ashley. Thank you everyone for participating.
Yeah, great job. Thank you. So we've gone over the suicide risk screening tool, and one of the actions that we're taking in almost every scenario is creating an effective suicide safety plan. So we'll go back to the Slido. What comes to mind when you hear the words feeling safe? Great support, security, having someone to talk to, trusted people, peace, not feeling judged. Great. Calm, safe environment, a comfortable community that you trust, choice. Yes, very trauma informed, feeling accepted, stability, consistency, able to talk in confidence, a bed to sleep and basic needs. Yeah, food, good support system. Being yourself, feeling seen and heard. Family, a lot of feeling comfortable and security. Yeah, basic needs. These are all parts of feeling safe. Stability, transparency. Great, thank you. So it's important we know what feeling safe looks like. How do we create that for the individuals we're working with, right? So in this context, what is a safety plan? So we're saying, what is a safety plan for suicide prevention? There's lots of safety plans that we work with in lots of different scenarios. And in this scenario, it is a tool that helps people manage their suicidal thoughts and provides this roadmap, right? A clear roadmap for seeking help when needed. That help can be internal, right? That help can be external. A safety plan should always be individually tailored. That's one of our first points. And we say individually tailored, though we may have a template, we want to make sure that the components in that template are really speak to that person. What does safety mean to them? What are their specific warning signs? Who are the people that they would go to? So that's the first really key component. And the second key component is we really need this to be practical and realistic. It's like a fire drill, right? If we don't have the doors labeled right, if we aren't going to actually take those actions, it's not going to work. So what is realistic for that individual? Would you call this hotline? Is this practical to reach out to this person? Are these supports and resources accessible to you? Are they provided in the languages that you need? So we really want to make sure that this is something realistic and not just something on a piece of paper. And finally, the third point is you want it to be simple and easy to remember. And one way that you could accomplish this is creating a larger safety plan, and then you could create like a card with some of the major points. Like, here's one thing I can do for myself. Here's one person I can reach out to, and here's one hotline I can call if I'm in crisis. So you can also make kind of more simpler versions because, again, thinking about when we're in crisis, we want to make sure that the path, the roadmap and path we're following is very easy to follow because we're not always going to have that cognition. We're going to be feeling really overwhelmed. And finally, the most important step in safety planning is really doing this with the person, right? So we're thinking through this situation with the person. That is how it's effective. So we're going to that collaboration, choice, empowerment, all of our trauma-informed care pieces. And we are on the left-hand side, there's an image and the resource should be dropped into the chat. And this is one of Switchboard's resources on an introduction to safety planning. That is going to have more detail, and we'll talk about some of that next. But there are also there's lots and lots of resources out there on how trainings on how to do safety planning. So we're going to take some time and talk about the 6 elements of a safety plan. And again, we're really going to think about this in the context of suicide prevention. There are templates that you can find that are available. There may be some of these components, but these are the pieces you want to be thinking through when you're thinking about keeping an individual safe. So the first thing is going to be warning signs. And this is going to be very individual, right? Though we talked about lots of warning signs that you as a provider can be looking out for. What are the warning signs for that individual? When do they know things aren't going well? When could other people notice, right? That's when we're collaborative. Maybe we bring in friends and family members like, hey, if I stop calling you for days, that's a problem. That's a warning sign for me when I'm isolating. Or if I'm having these intrusive thoughts and they can't go away, I can't seem to make them go away, for the individual, that could be a warning sign. So essentially, when do you know things are worse? And the second from that is, okay, I've recognized warning signs. What do I do now? What are my coping strategies? How do I decrease that distress? And those are coping skills that someone may do for themselves. Those could be talking to a friend as a distraction, but essentially, what has worked in the past? That's a question I usually ask. Has anything helped to make this better? What have you tried? Would you be open to trying something new? Could I teach you some coping strategies that you could practice? So really developing, again, things are very individually tailored, that either someone has tried and it's been successful, or that it's realistic, right? I'm willing to try this. Another element to consider is the environment, right? So that's kind of the prevention. So we want to remove any potential danger. How can we make, maybe it's home, maybe it's other places, how do we make that safer? The first thing that comes to mind is removing access to firearms. So someone who is having suicidal thoughts that has a firearm in the home, that is extremely dangerous. So is there a friend who could hold on to that, or a family member? What types of locks are on there? Is there a trigger lock? Is there a larger lock? Ideally, we're removing that out of the home. Also looking, is there someone else who could have maybe more control of medication? Can we put it in a lockbox? So looking at how do we keep the home safer? And next, we're going to talk about natural support. So a lot of times in the safety plan, we're like, these are my warning signs. This is how I know things are that things aren't going well. This is when I know things are getting worse. And I have a coping strategy and I've tried it. It's not working. What do I do now? So the natural supports are family, friends, community members. It could be faith-based organizations, support groups. So who can I reach out to? What's that first level of external support? Perhaps that's a friend that I just call to go for walks with, that I don't necessarily need that emotional support, but they can provide me with a distraction. Or maybe there's a close family member that I really can talk to and kind of work through some of the issues that are bothering me. So we want to have on the safety plan, kind of identify some of those safe people, natural supports in the community. And then, of course, we also want to have professional supports. So are there mental health providers that you're working with? Are there um, first responders or hotlines? There's a lot of warm lines that you can call to just talk. There's also crisis lines like 988. They can call when things are more at a level of a crisis. A lot of communities do have mobile crisis units as an alternative to first responders to law enforcement. So is there a mobile crisis unit in the community would the individual feel more comfortable contacting, and then again, empowering and giving that information so they can do that directly? And then finally, we want to have, kind of fitting into the last component that I just said, is an action plan. So essentially crisis planning. What are the specific actions that someone can do to stay safe? So kind of all of these things are not quite working yet, and you're feeling, the individual's feeling very unsafe, that they are in danger. What are steps that they could take? Would they? I will call 988, or I will take myself to a hospital. I'll call a mobile crisis unit. I'll call a family or friend member. I'll tell them how unsafe I am and have them come to help me. So having an action plan is another really key element of a safety plan. Okay. So at this point, we are working with clients. We've determined a risk level. We've decided to do a safety plan. We've done the safety plan, and we noticed there are a lot of gaps in that support side, right? There's not a lot of community supports. There's no professional supports. So another piece as a direct service provider is, how do we increase those supports, right? So usually that is done through making referrals, something that is done really frequently in your day-to-day work. So how do we connect people to those supports if we're noticing those gaps? So the first step is going to be know your community resources, right? So what are the community resources? Is there a mental health mobile crisis unit? Are there providers that have experience with suicidal ideation? Are there providers that are culturally and linguistically aligned to my client? So we want to know what are the resources in your community. Next, once we know the resources, is we want to be able to provide that information. So again, collaborative and individually tailored, right? I want to provide the information to the individual or family and say, this is what's available. What would be helpful? What's realistic as a support for you to engage in? Then the third piece is, we're going to be encouraging choice, right? So again, what would be helpful for you, and answer questions. So if you go to this support, it looks like this, and this, right? They're going to do this, or that. So you're going to really want to learn about your referrals. You want to be able to have that information to be able to answer questions that clients have. And then fourth is, we're always going to gain consent before we make a referral. We're not going to get nervous and make a bunch of phone calls because the client doesn't want help, right? We consent. So that's your release of information. We know that the exception is imminent danger, but in this case, we're just looking to make referrals to increase support. So we're not calling first responders. So we want to gain consent before making a referral. And that's part of that trust between our clients. And finally, when possible, it really does increase the likelihood of individuals connecting if we can make a warm handoff. So can you make that phone call with the client present? Can you kind of provide some information with consent to the provider you're referring to when possible? So a warm handoffs are always encouraged when we can. And then finally, if that connection is made and now they have support, especially with a mental health provider, we really want to look at, okay, what are the roles and responsibilities now? I'm a direct service provider, but now you have a mental health provider as well. Kind of, who do you go to for what concern? And I think, especially when we're thinking about like a mental health clinic, there's oftentimes a really robust infrastructure for dealing with crisis. They'll have a crisis hotline. They'll know the clients when you call. They'll have all the notes. They'll have a crisis clinician on staff. Maybe they have groups. They have people who are really trained in doing this work. So you really want to have that conversation with the client of, like, that came up in the slide of, like, this isn't my area of expertise, and our organization doesn't really have that infrastructure to support you. But this is where you would go with those concerns. Great. So I think we're going to go back to our case scenario. So we're going to return again to Zara and we kind of think through what would be those final steps now. So we're going to help create a safety plan, right? And part of helping to create a safety plan is what are those coping strategies? What are the supports that are there? And we're going to ensure if there are any gaps in supports, we're going to ensure that there's referrals to community resources. Maybe it's a support group, maybe it's a counseling service. Provide a warm handoff if possible. We want to make sure that Zara knows like when is her next scheduled appointment with you or with a provider you're referring to, and kind of making sure we're following up. And so in summary, I do want to say that suicide prevention really begins with increasing protective factors, right? Again, the work that is happening day to day, increasing those protective factors and supporting your client's mental health. So throughout the work, things that we can do are remind clients of their resilience and instill hope for the future. Hope for the future is a huge protective factor. We also really want to connect people to meaningful activities. So how do we increase that sense of belonging? How to increase all those social safety nets? We really want to refer and connect as much as possible. And then finally, of course, we want to provide information and referrals for ongoing mental health support. And that could include professional support like counseling or support groups, but also psychoeducation. So providing information about kind of what's happening and coping skills. How do we teach some basic coping skills to address some of that distress? So again, every day you are working to support individuals and families. And we hope you have more tools now to feel empowered to recognize warning signs and prevent suicide in your communities.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Lots of information was shared today, and you taught us quite a bit. I'm so grateful that we have some time for questions because it was a lot of information. We did receive quite a few questions submitted when, folks were registering, and I hope that many of you feel that some of those questions were answered. But I did pull some that we would like to ask now, as well as the Q&A is open, everyone. So please drop in any other questions that may pop up. So the first question, Ashley, that I have for you, how does suicide prevention differ when working with clients remotely? And you're muted, Ashley. It's okay.
Step one, unmute. So that is a great question. So much of our work now is virtual. We touched on it just kind of briefly in a few examples, but let's take privacy would be a first stop. We don't really know who's in the room. If you're in an office and there's lots of people in the background, that's going to be very distracting to someone that's not going to feel safe. So again, who's in the room with you, and then as much as you can, if it's safe and comfortable for the individual you're talking to kind of to prompt, like, would you want to go to a more private space in your home to talk? So I think that's one key thing. There's pros and cons with the virtual. One of the cons is it's more difficult to observe behavior when you're in a remote setting to pick up on those warning signs. It's just going to be harder than when someone's in person. On the pro side is that I do think that people can feel more comfortable talking virtually. Some people it's a more comfortable setting to talk about things that are uncomfortable versus in person. So there could be some more openness. When you're working with low and medium risk, so again, we're talking about safety planning, providing resources, following up. That's really probably going to be pretty similar in person or virtually. You can do all that virtually. You want to make sure we have some virtual programs where the provider and the client live in very different places. So you definitely want to make sure you've resource mapped where all the resources for where your clients are currently living and staying, so you can refer them to the appropriate. I think where things get a bit challenging is for high-risk clients. So when someone's high risk, there is that potentially you do need to do a welfare check. You need to call for first responders. And so do you know their physical address? That's going to be one of the first things. If you needed to call for first responders, do you know where to send them? And so you may need to just ask directly, and you may not get that information, but it's something to consider. And then also, who is in the home with the client? Are there allies? Are there people, family members that can collaborate on a safety plan, can help kind of maybe reduce the need to actually have that call to first responders. So those are some things to keep in mind. We're always looking at the like least intrusive or lowest level of care possible. And so thinking about, is there a mobile crisis unit in that community? You're virtual, you can't be there, but is there a mobile crisis unit that, usually they have a peer, they have a licensed clinician, it's without law enforcement. So really, again, being aware of what's available in the communities where your clients are. That was a long answer.
Long answer, but very, very great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Um, a question that popped in just now, once a safety plan is developed, how often should one review it with the client?
I think you want to review a safety plan when there is still ongoing risk, right? It's going to be really individual. I don't think we have a standard, but if something changes, that would be a time. We had this safety plan, and now you've lost your job recently. Have things? Is there more increased risk? If something has changes in their support networks, so that safety plan isn't really working. But I think it would really depend on risk. A lower risk client, you may be able to develop that safety plan and just check in. Has this been working? Have you tried your coping skills? Someone who's more moderate, high risk, that might be something you're reviewing more frequently. And not just like reading through, but in the last week, have you had any warning signs? And if you did you try your coping strategies? So yeah, it would probably depend on the risk level. Yep.
Okay,
Great
thank
question.
you. Okay. Um, there's some really great questions. So I'm just trying to pick the
I'm
next
ready.
one. Let's see. Okay, we have time. We have time. So
Lots of time.
someone put a question in about just asking for some tips for initiating the conversation. So you went over the how to have the conversation. We went through the Columbia Protocol, but case managers feel nervous or employment, staff feel nervous because this is not their wheelhouse. And
Mhm.
so we want to ensure that, staff are comfortable at least asking those first two questions. And so
Yeah.
what would you say to those staff or who are having trouble asking the questions directly, especially when it comes to working with younger clients?
So the answer is never anyone's favorite. I would role play, everyone's favorite tool, but essentially you have to practice. These questions still feel uncomfortable for me, and I've asked them hundreds of times, right? It is an uncomfortable thing. I think if you can really put yourself in the mindset of this person's in pain and they're in distress, and this is a way I can maybe offer relief. I'm showing them by asking these questions, I'm showing I can handle the answers and I'm safe. But if you know that the questions are going to come out like really hard and awkward, then practice with each other. Sit down with another caseworker and say, let's just go over it and practice, because though there's like really clearly stated questions, you may have a way that you're going to ask that's like slightly different, right? And you want to get really comfortable in how you're going to ask. You might simplify. Are you having thoughts to kill yourself? Like, really direct. And so that is my recommendation, is that especially if this is not an area that comes up in your work a lot, it will of course feel uncomfortable. So as much
Hmm.
as you can learn about the topic and practice out loud in person in front of a mirror, video, you're just going to feel it. And again, I do think that's a less intimidating way to frame it, is really those first two questions. At that point, we're probably going to bring in a supervisor or someone else who can kind of do further assessment. So just getting those first two questions to know, oh wow, this is this could potentially not just be low risk. This could be moderate or even really high risk.
Hmm. Thank you. This gets into a question that someone else had asked early on. And you kind of answered it with this,
Okay.
and I also want us to emphasize just a little bit more if people are still having, some concerns about why is it important to be direct when asking these questions versus not asking at all.
Well, versus not asking at all is that we don't want to do that, because if you have noticed any warning signs, someone is attempting to tell you what's going on. They might not be saying it directly, but they're showing you with their behaviors, right? Or maybe they're saying things like, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. People are showing warning signs and they're giving you hints, because they don't know, are you going to be okay with this? Are you going to be able to handle this? Can I trust you? Do you also have a really strong stigma against this? So not asking is, to me, as a direct service provider working with vulnerable individuals, that's just not an option. We're always asking. And asking directly, it's actually easier to just ask the question, especially a short direct. If you're like, well, this probably isn't happening to you, and I have to ask everybody, but maybe possibly you're thinking that you're going to lose the client, and they are not going to feel that you are a trusted, confident person who can handle this information. And that's what we're trying to portray. I'm safe. I'm trusted. I can handle this. I can find you the support you need. Yeah, I think, did that answer the question?
It definitely did.
Okay, okay.
It's so important for us to reiterate that. A question about interpretation. What are some tips or best practices when working with interpreters?
Yeah, so again, I think this goes to the previous question of asking directly versus, like, softening. I think we need to be really aware of any stigma or cultural nuances around talking about suicide. I will often say, hey, it's really important for me to as close to word as possible what this individual is saying, because that helps me to know what to ask. And so really kind of asking to make sure that interpretation on both sides is as close to word as possible. We want to remind about confidentiality, of course. Um, we want to make sure as a provider we're not using any jargon. We want to think like, can this translate? Again, a direct question is much easier to translate than if you're kind of getting really wordy and not being clear.
Mm.
If you have in-house interpreters, which is like a wonderful thing, I would provide the suicide prevention training, so that way the people have that background understanding of why are they asking this question in this really specific way, right? There's a reason for that.
Hmm.
Um, and whenever I do any work that is heavy, which this is, with interpreters, I'm always going to do a debrief. So just remember that secondary trauma on you, it's also on our interpreters. So like, hey, can we check in with you? I know this is not normally the type of topics we talk about. Like, are you doing okay? Do you have any questions for me? Why I asked this? Things like that. So those are some kind of general when working with interpreters.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. We have a question. Is the safety plan we have available on a Switchboard website available in other languages? So at this time, we do not have the safety plan template in other languages, but the best way to make this need known would be to submit a technical assistance request through our website, which should be dropped in the chat shortly if it's not already, and just identifying that this is a need. That request would go through our internal review process, and I can also bring this up to my supervisor as well if we see that this is a need throughout. Um, we also had a question about resources that service providers can provide to clients directly. If you all aren't familiar, Settle In is a website that has created a plethora of resources that are client facing. And so please, check that out. And you can also submit technical assistance requests through them as well if you need additional support. Let's see, Ashley, we have a few more minutes. Um, Someone asked, what do you do when the caregiver or parent is suicidal and the child is also suicidal? Where would you begin as the service provider with the assessment? Should they start with the caregiver or the child?
Yeah, that's probably a very unique situation. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say, if possible, bring in another staff member as soon as possible, right? This is
Supervisor.
not
Mm-hmm.
a one person job. I would start with the youth. If there was like a where would you start? I think that these situations are nuanced. I'd also maybe look, is there a way that we know at this point that someone is at higher risk? Maybe the caregiver is at imminent risk of doing something, and the youth is not. They're just having some of these thoughts, not just, but having thoughts.
Hmm.
And you'd also want to be very aware to not leave someone alone and to really make thinking about that imminent risk. I would say that these scenarios get very complex very quickly. Not to not answer that question, but this is where you consult. Like
Hmm.
one person and two people at risk. In any scenario, let's get more staff. Two, consult, consult, consult. This is a huge burden to carry alone. That leads to massive burnout. You never want to feel like I made this decision alone and it wasn't the right decision. So we're consulting, we're making these decisions collaboratively with our clients, with caregivers, with our supervisors. But yeah, I would say the things I would consider, it's essentially vulnerability. Your youth is more vulnerable, but also what is the risk level of the two people in the room? Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
I hope no one's ever in that situation.
Yeah, we're getting quite a few people with very specific
I
client
just have a little bit about
scenarios.
youth. The specific scenarios we could,
We couldn't address. I was just gonna
that's
say
when you
we.
come to someone like me in your
Hmm.
organization and do a one-on-one case consult, which
Hmm.
if you have someone in your organization, you really want to do those because the questions we ask, we're going to need to we need to gather more information or ask you to gather more information so we can do a much more thorough assessment of what's
Yes.
happening. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
There's no kind
Um,
of, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, no worries. Um, what about if you ask someone the first two questions and they say no, but you suspect they're not being honest? What would you say your next step would be, or what would you encourage a staff person to do if they are kind of stuck on this person is not being honest? I know that they're suicidal. I see the warning signs, but they're telling me no.
I mean, I think you could do the full assessment. You don't need to just stop at question one and two because someone said no, especially if your instincts. So you could go through and ask questions. If someone's denying all aspects and you still have concerns about their safety, I'd want to know kind of why do you have those concerns? Like, what is it what is happening in your gut that's telling you, or what information do you have that is increasing that risk? And also being sure that that's not your own discomfort, that really is the risk you're picking up. And so again, you want to consult, but you want to try to, I wouldn't stop the assessment. You don't have to stop it at the first two questions. You can continue asking all the way through. We always want to ask that last question on past suicidal behaviors. So I would
Hmm.
continue the assessment, see what information you can gather. If the screening tool, if someone is denying all things and you still have concerns, then you're going to need to kind of talk to someone and see what other actions can we take. Yeah.
Thank you. What are some tips you would give to a service provider who is addressing suicide prevention with several clients? How does one protect their own mental health?
So I know I already said this once, but I'd go back to share the burden, right?
Hmm.
So for consulting, the what often leads to that burnout, one, it's the content, right? It feels very high stake and it's the content. So we're gonna take care of ourselves the same way we are with any other distressing content. So what are your coping skills? What supports? But I think especially around suicidal behavior, that sense of feeling responsible that I might do something wrong and the risks are the stakes are really high, that can be very heavy on. So if we're sharing that, we're always consulting. These are decisions that are made in collaboration with other people. Then you don't feel as much of that weight of that burden that this was a choice that I made, right? So that is one of the reasons we consult, and the other is the situations are often nuanced, and the more people, if you can have more minds thinking about the situation. I mean, not all the minds. We still want to think about confidentiality, but
Hmm.
but yeah, the other is I think trying to be more comfortable with the uncomfortable. So if you are a direct service provider and all of a sudden suicidal thoughts are coming up a lot and it's really new to you, you're attending this webinar, so that's a good start. But you want to get comfortable with what's uncomfortable. So can I learn more about this? Can I read more about this? Can I practice this? How do I gain more skills? Because the stress generally, when we're in a situation with a client, the stress comes when we don't know what to do. right? No,
Yeah.
that's a helplessness we don't want to be. So if you feel like I do know what to do, I know I have these questions to ask, and I have this person I consult with, and I do XYZ if this happens. So the more you have kind of that process and tools, the less there is that sense of like, this is happening and I have no idea what to do. And that's really, I think, where that heaviness can come from and that burnout. Yeah,
Yeah.
great question.
Yeah. Great answer. Thank you. Um, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm just skimming through. So many have popped in, and I'm so grateful that many of you are still with us. Let's see. What do you find are the most common mistakes that providers make when trying to connect with a client in an active suicidal crisis who isn't engaging? That's a really deep and good question.
There's a lot of things happening in
The-
that question, which is a great question.
It's a great
Uh,
question.
So read the scenario part again. So I got the what are some of the mistakes that a provider could make. So we're looking at maybe
If a
what
client is actively suicidal
if a client's actively suicidal
and they're not engaging.
and they're not engaging. Again, I want to ask so many follow-up questions about the scenario because that's how this kind of works. I mean, what we say many times, the biggest mistake is not asking and not acting. Is like, all right, well, they're not engaging, but they're actively suicidal. I'll just let it be. No, we're going to take action. If someone is actively suicidal, I kind of want to know that definition. So, like we said, if someone's actively suicidal, meaning they have stated they have suicidal thoughts, they have a plan, and they're taking steps on that plan. Well, they're now at imminent risk. Most people at that point are not engaging in help, right? At that point, that's kind of definition. So we would need to, that is when we would be able to break confidentiality and we would need to make a call to mental health providers. Maybe at this point, we're calling in first responders. If we're saying actively suicidal, meaning they're having suicidal ideation, just thoughts. We've asked the questions. I'm actively suicidal. I think that's where we went through all those definitions because you're like, well, what do you mean by that? So I'm having suicidal thoughts. I'm thinking I don't want to be here. I'm thinking I want to die, but no, I don't have a plan. I haven't thought about a plan. I've never done anything in the past, but I'm having these very intrusive thoughts. And for some people, those intrusive thoughts they're very distressing, right? And so if someone's not engaging, at that point, we are trying to safety plan, trying to referrals, but there's not imminent risk. There's not really a lot you can do at that point. You
Hmm.
want to go through all those action steps. You want to ask the questions. But in that scenario, that's just increasing check-ins, asking again, maybe reviewing a safety plan. Again, you want to follow your organization policies. For some organizations, a client is not engaging at all is a client that might not be appropriate for care there. But we always want to provide, here's where you can go, here's where you can go for a crisis if things get worse. If you change your mind and you do want to get help, you want to make sure that people always have that information.
Yeah. Thank you, Ashley. We
Yeah.
we fired those questions at you pretty fast, so thank you so much. We appreciate you.
All
So
good. All
now
good.
we hope that you all are able to identify protective factors, risk factors, and warning signs of suicide. You are also able to apply the four practical skills to ensure your communication with clients about suicide is assertive, clear, and compassionate. You're able to implement these 6 questions of the suicide risk screening tool with fidelity and confidence. And you're able to create effective suicide safety plans with clients, including those 6 key elements. So before we share our recommended resources, we'd like to ask you all to help us help you. If you could please scan this QR code, the link will also be in the chat. The survey is extremely important to help us improve our future trainings. Our survey is 3 questions and should take you about 30 seconds to complete. So if you can take 30 seconds now to complete the survey, we would really appreciate that. All right. Awesome. So here are our recommended resources for you all. We are also sharing these in the chat. Several of you asked about the slides being shared. You will receive the slides with these links that will be live for you to click directly on. So please, visit our website. We shared some additional resources as well throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions that come up, don't hesitate to reach out to Switchboard through our technical assistance link as well. So please stay connected with us. For more training and technical assistance, you can go to our website. You can visit us on LinkedIn. We also have our YouTube. So you can send us an email or just click on our social media. On behalf of all of us here at Switchboard, we want to thank you for learning with us, and we hope to see you all again soon.